She fled into the Duke's chambers, unaware he'd just returned from war. When their eyes met, the rain fell upon Yorkshire like a whispered confession, each drop striking the windows of Ravensbourne Manor with the persistence of a secret that would not remain buried. It was October of 1852, and the servants had lit every lamp in the lower halls to hold back the darkness that gathered early in autumn. Yet in the private corridors above, where the family rooms lay scattered like scattered jewels along a narrow passage, the light grew thin and uncertain. Eveline Hartwell stood motionless outside her chamber door, her hand trembling as it gripped the handle. The voices from below, sharp, accusatory, Lady Agatha's tones cutting through the murmur of evening conversation, still rang in her ears like discordant notes from a broken pianoforte. Another rumour, she thought, pressing her forehead against the cool wood. Another whispered insinuation that my presence brings shame. She had endured it before, the careful distance in greetings, the meaningful silences when she entered a room, the way certain ladies' eyes would narrow, as though they were reading a damning confession written upon her very skin. But tonight, something had fractured within her. That careful composure she had cultivated with such precision, that armor of propriety that had kept her standing upright through seasons of subtle cruelty. She could not remain in her chamber. The walls seemed to press inward, and the shadows beneath her window felt like accusations. So she had slipped into the corridor, her candle held before her like a trembling prayer, seeking the only refuge she knew in this great house, the library, that vast silent sanctuary where no one questioned a woman lost among books. But the corridor seemed to have conspired against her. In her distress, she had turned left instead of right at the great staircase, and now found herself standing before a door she recognized but had never entered, the Duke's private chambers. His rooms had been shuttered for months while he was away at war, a war that had consumed him the way some men consume whiskey, leaving nothing but silence and shadow in its wake. He was not expected to return until November. The household had settled into the belief that at least one room in Ravensbourne would remain undisturbed, a sealed tomb of propriety and solitude. Eveline's hand found the door handle before her mind could counsel restraint. It turned. The room beyond was darkness itself, broken only by the faint glow of embers in the fireplace. The warmth that rose from those dying flames enveloped her as she stepped inside, and for a moment, just a moment, she allowed herself to believe that she had found sanctuary. The air smelled of sandalwood and leather, of cigars left unsmoked, of a man's study undisturbed. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, as though she could inhale peace itself. That was when the voice came, not loud but laden with the weight of command. "Who enters my chambers?" Eveline's breath stopped in her throat. The candle fell from her hand and scattered across the floor, plunging them both into deeper shadow. In the sudden darkness, punctuated only by the amber glow of the fireplace, she could make out a figure rising from a chair near the hearth. Tall, impossibly tall. Still wearing, she realized with a shock that seemed to halt her very heart, a military coat, though unbuttoned, as though he had come through the door mere hours before and simply ceased moving. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I did not—" The words tangled upon her tongue like silk threads caught on a spool, but the figure moved and the firelight caught his face for the first time. She recognized him at once, though she had glimpsed him only once before, months ago, a figure on horseback riding out toward the distant war. Adrian Wolfe, the Duke of Ravensbourne, had aged a decade in the space of one. His face was thinner, marked by lines that spoke of sleeplessness and suffering. A thin scar, pale against his darkened skin, traced the line of his jaw. But it was his eyes that arrested her completely, green as winter water, exhausted and infinitely sad, yet watching her with an intensity that seemed to see not merely Eveline Hartwell, a poor relation in a borrowed grey dress, but something far more essential. "Madam," he said, his voice still bearing that same weight of command, yet softened now by something that might have been wonder or confusion. "You are not the intruder I expected." For a long moment, neither spoke. The rain continued its endless percussion against the windows. The fire crackled, sending shadows dancing across the walls like specters. Eveline became acutely aware of every detail, the way his hand trembled slightly as he steadied himself against the back of the chair, the way his breathing seemed shallow, as though he had not yet fully returned to the world of the living, the way his gaze moved from her face to her rain-dampened dress, and then, with infinite care, back to her eyes. "I should not be here," Eveline whispered. "I have trespassed. I will withdraw at once." "No," The word came as a command, yet his tone was almost pleading. "Do not go. He paused, and in that pause she saw him struggle with something internal, some battle being waged behind those exhausted eyes. "Pray forgive me. It has been a very long time since I have had a visitor in these chambers. I fear my manners have suffered considerable atrophy." Despite the weight of impropriety that descended upon the moment, for she was alone with him, unchaperoned in his private rooms, a scandal that Lady Agatha could weaponize beyond measure, Eveline found herself stepping forward, rather than retreating. "You have returned from the war," she said. It was not a question. "This very day," he replied, and something in his voice spoke of the devastation that statement contained. "I came directly to my rooms, expecting solitude. Instead, I find—" He trailed off, studying her face with an expression that was almost reverent. "I find a young lady who stands as though she, too, has been fleeing something." The observation struck her with the force of a blow, so accurate was it. Tears sprang to her eyes before she could prevent them, and she turned away mortified at being thus perceived, thus known by a stranger, for he was a stranger, was he not? Yet the way he looked at her suggested otherwise. It suggested a recognition that transcended social niceties and formal introduction. "I did not mean to intrude, Your Grace," she said, her voice fracturing. There was a matter of some distressing conversation below. I sought only a moment of peace." He was silent for a long moment. Then slowly he extended his hand toward her, not in greeting but in offering. In that gesture was a vulnerability that seemed to cost him greatly, as though he asked her not merely to take his hand, but to acknowledge that he, too, was frightened. Eveline did not take it. Instead, she met his eyes once more. "When they discover I have been here," she said quietly, "they will judge you as harshly as they judge me." His expression hardened with something that might have been resolve, or might have been a species of grief. "Then let them judge. I have returned from a place where judgment matters far less than honor, and it would be deeply dishonorable to cast out a woman who has sought refuge in her time of need." He paused. "May I know your name?" "Eveline Hartwell, daughter of the late Dr. Hartwell, and ward of your cousin, Mrs. Hensmore." At this, something shifted in his expression. Recognition, perhaps, of the way she had positioned herself, not arrogantly claiming relation, but humbly establishing her place. And somehow, in speaking her own name aloud to him, she felt as though she had given him a key. "Miss Hartwell," he said, and the way he spoke her name was as though it mattered, as though she mattered. "I am Adrian Wolfe, and I suspect that you and I are not so very different after all." The intimacy of him offering his given name, of his admitting to kinship in their respective sufferings, seemed to change the very air between them. Outside, the rain fell harder. Inside, in that room lit only by firelight and the memory of a candle, two people who had been standing alone in the darkness suddenly found themselves visible to one another. And when, after an hour of quiet conversation, of shared observations about the cruelty of expectations and the courage required to simply endure, he walked her to the corridor and saw her safely to the branching path that led toward her own chambers, his hand lingered upon her arm for just a moment longer than propriety would allow. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "perhaps you might find your way to the library. I have always found that books understand us better than people do." She did not answer him. She could not, for her voice had abandoned her entirely. But as she made her way back to her own room, she carried with her the warmth of the fire, the scent of sandalwood, and the memory of a man's eyes, eyes that had looked upon her not with judgment, but with the profound kindness of one who has learned what it means to be broken and has chosen not to break further. The key she had seen fall beside his chair, that small ornate thing of iron and secrets, remained upon his floor waiting for morning. The library of Ravensbourne Manor was a cathedral of silence, its towering shelves ascending toward a ceiling lost in shadow, its windows tall and mullioned, and framing the grey Yorkshire autumn like paintings in a gallery of melancholy. By day, the light that filtered through the rain-spotted glass painted everything in shades of silver and ash. By afternoon, when the rain began again, as it seemed to do with the constancy of a heartbeat, the room became a place suspended between worlds. Eveline did not go seeking him the following afternoon. Instead, she simply arrived at the library as she had taken to doing in the months of her residence at Ravensbourne, finding her solace among books that asked nothing of her, except that she read them carefully. She selected a volume of poetry, Wordsworth, whose melancholy matched the weather, and settled herself in a chair near the window. She had not even read a full page when she heard footsteps, Adrian paused in the library doorway as though surprised to find her there, though she suspected and would later confirm that he had been watching the corridors, waiting for her to appear. He was dressed more carefully today, in fine wool of charcoal grey, his military coat left behind in favour of civilian dress. Yet the authority he carried seemed to cling to him still, evident in the way he held himself upright, despite the clear effort it cost him. "Miss Hartwell," he said, and there was warmth in his voice, genuine pleasure at finding her. "I had hoped, that is, I wondered whether you might find your way here." "I come to the library most afternoons, Your Grace," she replied, though she knew the careful formality of address was a wall between them, one she raised not because she wished to, but because propriety demanded it. They were not yet even acquaintances, in the eyes of the world. They were nothing at all, though I confess I did not expect to find it occupied. He moved into the room with the deliberate care of a man relearning how to inhabit spaces. "I thought perhaps we might discuss the matter of yesterday's intrusion," he said, "unless you prefer to pretend it did not occur." "I am uncertain," Eveline said truthfully, "whether pretense is possible. Lady Agatha has already begun to whisper that I was seen on the upper corridor last evening, at an hour when respectable young ladies are within their chambers. The insinuation, though carefully couched, is quite clear." His expression darkened. "What does my cousin Agatha know of my whereabouts? Very little, I suspect. Her insinuation rests not upon knowledge, but upon supposition. However," Eveline paused, choosing her words with care, "supposition, when repeated often enough, begins to sound like truth. By the time the ton arrives for the autumn assemblies, the story will have been polished to the point that I shall be cast as either a shameless adventuress or a pathetic creature seeking to entrap a nobleman. Either conclusion will serve to diminish me beyond recovery." Adrian moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back in the gesture she had come to recognize as his habit when grappling with something troubling. "Then we must ensure they see a different story altogether." "Your Grace," Eveline said, and she heard the note of desperation in her own voice, the vulnerability that came from hoping he might somehow possess the power to alter the unalterable. "There is no story that the ton will accept. I am a woman without family connection, without dowry, and without beauty to recommend me. I am a convenience to Mrs. Hensmore and a point of contention to everyone else. My presence in this house is already viewed with suspicion." "Then why do you remain?" he asked, turning to face her fully. There was no judgment in the question, only genuine curiosity. "Why not seek a post as a governess or a companion in another household?" Eveline looked down at her book, though the words blurred before her eyes. "Because," she said softly, "I have learned that there is no escaping oneself, no matter how far one travels. The shame of rumor follows like a shadow. At least here, in this house, I have found moments of, if not peace, then something approaching it." He was quiet for a very long time. When next he spoke, his voice carried a strange weight. "Last night, when I found you in my chambers, I felt as though I had stumbled upon something precious that I did not know I had lost. For months, Miss Hartwell, I have been alone in the darkest possible ways. The war took from me more than I can articulate, without seeming to burden others with griefs that are no longer relevant. I returned to England expecting to resume the mantle of duty, of propriety, of the titles and responsibilities that define my station. Instead, I found myself unable to construct even the most basic facade of normalcy." He moved closer to her, and though he maintained the careful distance propriety demanded, his proximity made her acutely aware of every breath she drew, every beat of her heart. "When you entered my chambers, uninvited, unannounced, you broke through something in me. You stood there, trembling and afraid, yet with such dignity in your fear, and I felt for the first time since my return that I was not alone in my fragility. It seemed to me that perhaps we had both been drowning, and in finding each other, we might at least offer testimony that we had been seen, we had been known." Eveline's hands trembled as she held her book. She could not meet his eyes, for fear that if she did, something crucial would shift between them, something that could not be contained by the careful boundaries of propriety that kept the world from crashing down upon them both. "If anyone discovers that we have spoken privately, or that I have come seeking you repeatedly, they will not discover it," he interrupted, and there was steel in his voice now, the command of the man who had led soldiers. "Not if we are careful. Not if we ensure that your visits to the library are consistent enough to be unremarkable, and that I come upon you by apparent accident, like any gentleman encountering a lady in a public room of the house. The servants will think nothing of it. As for Agatha, She is too preoccupied with her own social machinations to notice anything that does not directly concern her. But you care, Eveline said, finally lifting her eyes to his. You care what she thinks, what they all think. You are a duke, Your Grace. Your reputation, unlike mine, is not yet ruined. I will not be the instrument of its ruin. Something flickered across his face, a pain so sharp and sudden that she nearly cried out at the sight of it. My reputation, he said bitterly, is a construct built upon foundations of sand and blood. I have killed men, Miss Hartwell. I have given orders that sent soldiers, boys, some of them, into situations from which they did not emerge. I have learned that honor is not a shield but a scar, and that duty is often another name for grief. If my reputation with the ton falls because I have dared to speak with a courageous woman, then perhaps it falls for a reason. Perhaps it falls so that something more true might be built in its place. He reached out his hand to her, not commanding now, but offering, asking with his entire body for her to trust him. Eveline rose to her feet, still holding her book like a talisman. She did not take his hand. Instead, she moved past him toward the shelves, running her fingers along the spines of the books that lined them. Tell me about the war, she said. If I am to be implicated in scandal for your sake, then I would know something of why that cost seems acceptable to you. And so he told her. Standing among the books of that cathedral of silence, with the rain drumming against the windows and the afternoon light fading into twilight, Adrian spoke of things he had perhaps told no one, of moments of bravery that felt meaningless in the face of so much death, of commanding men he had come to love like brothers, into circumstances that destroyed them, of returning home to discover that the rooms he had known in childhood felt utterly foreign, as though he had been transformed by his experiences into something that could never fit into the shapes of his previous life. And Eveline listened. She listened with the kind of attention that does not demand consolation or false hope, but simply bears witness. She understood in her own way what it meant to be transformed by circumstances beyond one's control, to return to familiar places only to discover that one had been fundamentally altered by absence and suffering. When he finished speaking, the room had grown quite dark. The rain had transformed the windows into mirrors, reflecting the soft light of the single lamp Eveline had lit. She turned to face him, and in her expression was something he had not seen directed toward himself since his return. Not pity, not revulsion, but acceptance, recognition. I do not think, she said carefully, that I am the one in need of rescue, Your Grace. But perhaps we might rescue each other. Perhaps that is what it means to truly know another person, to hold the terrible truths of them, and to choose anyway to stand beside them. He did take her hand then, briefly, reverently, allowing his fingers to touch hers for only a moment before stepping away. Then we shall have each other's company in this library, he said softly. As long as the rain falls and the world remains outside these walls, we shall have this, and perhaps it will be enough. But both of them understood as the evening deepened and she finally took her leave, that enough was a fragile thing, sustained only by secrecy, and that secrets, in the eyes of the ton, were the most damning confessions of all. November arrived with the smell of wood smoke and the promise of the autumn assemblies that would soon populate Ravensbourne with guests from across the county. The household stirred with activity, servants polishing silver, seamstresses letting out seams in evening gowns, the cook planning menus that would showcase the bounty of the estate. Yet in the midst of all this preparation, a shadow hung over the halls. Lady Agatha had begun to move with a deliberate purposefulness, her eyes bright with the zeal of a woman who had discovered an accusation she could wield with devastating effect. She had said nothing outright. Propriety forbade such directness, but her remarks had become pointed. The way she mentioned Eveline's name in conversation with the visiting doctor was freighted with significance. The lingering glances she cast at her nephew when Eveline was mentioned spoke volumes. And then, on a grey afternoon 3 weeks into November, matters reached their inevitable crescendo. The gathering had been organized as a small tea, a rehearsal of sorts, for the larger autumn ball that would take place the following week. Ladies from the neighbouring estates had been invited, along with the wives and daughters of the gentry. It was meant to be an occasion for refining the seating arrangements and ensuring that the orchestra hired for the main event understood the precise number of dances that would be required. Eveline had not wished to attend. She had begged Mrs. Hensmore, Eveline's cousin and the mistress of the household, to allow her to remain in her chamber. But propriety and the need to demonstrate that she had nothing to hide drove her to take her place in the drawing room, dressed in her finest grey silk, her movements careful and graceful, her smile fixed in that particular expression of polite distance that she had perfected over months. Clara Hensmore, Mrs. Hensmore's niece and Eveline's only true friend in the household, found her standing near the refreshment table, her teacup untouched in her hands. "They are saying the most dreadful things," Clara whispered urgently, her pale face flushed with indignation. "Lady Agatha has been circulating the most shameful insinuation, that you have been deliberately seeking private moments with His Grace, that you have been contriving encounters in the library, that your behavior has been that of a woman attempting to entrap the Duke into an unsuitable connection." Eveline's hands went cold. She set down her teacup with deliberate care, aware that every eye in the room had turned toward her, aware of the sudden silence that had fallen over the assembled ladies. "How does Lady Agatha come to possess such specific knowledge?" Eveline asked, her voice steady though her heart thundered in her chest. "She saw you both through the library door last Tuesday," Clara said miserably. "She did not see anything improper, but she has fashioned an entire narrative from the mere fact of your togetherness. She is saying that you have been attempting to seduce His Grace while his mind is still fragile from the war. She is suggesting that you are a fortune hunter of the worst sort." The accusation struck Eveline like a physical blow. To be cast as predatory, as calculating, as willing to exploit a wounded man's vulnerability, it was a fate worse than mere social exclusion. It was a character annihilation that would follow her for the remainder of her life. But before she could form a response, before she could speak even a single word in her own defense, the drawing-room doors opened. Adrian entered, still in the formal dark coat and waistcoat of his station, his bearing erect and commanding. His eyes moved across the assembled ladies until they found her, and when they did, something in his expression shifted, hardened, clarified, became absolute. He walked directly to Eveline, his footsteps the only sound in the suddenly silent room. He did not greet her with the careful distance propriety demanded. Instead, he extended his hand to her, openly, deliberately, before every witness that Lady Agatha had carefully assembled. "Miss Hartwell," he said, and his voice was that of the man who had commanded armies, a voice that brooked no contradiction. "I have come to request the honor of your company for the opening dance of the ball next week, unless you mean to refuse me." Eveline's breath caught. She was aware of Lady Agatha's sharp intake of breath, aware of the murmuring that had begun among the assembled ladies, aware that this single gesture, the Duke extending his hand to the woman accused of attempting to entrap him, had fundamentally altered everything. Slowly, carefully, she placed her hand in his. "I would be honored, Your Grace," she said, and her voice was steady, though she felt as though she might shatter into 1,000 pieces. But Adrian did not release her hand. Instead, he turned to address the assembly, and his words fell like hammer blows upon an anvil, reshaping the shape of truth itself. "Before you all," he said, "I wish to make a declaration. Miss Hartwell has been the subject of gossip that lacks not only charity but also truth. I wish to be absolutely clear. Her conduct has been beyond reproach, her character of the highest order. If there has been conversation between us in the library, it is because I sought her counsel during a time of considerable personal difficulty. If she has granted me her attention and her kindness, it is because she possesses the virtue of true compassion, a quality that seems to be growing increasingly rare among those of higher station." He paused, and in that pause was all the weight of his ducal authority. "Furthermore," he continued, "I wish it to be known that I intend to speak to Miss Hartwell's guardian regarding a matter of considerable significance, but that conversation must occur in private before any further speculation can be unleashed." With that, he released her hand and withdrew from the drawing-room, leaving behind him a vacuum of shock and confusion. Within moments, the gentle murmuring had become frantic conversation. Lady Agatha, her face a study in frustrated fury, excused herself on the pretext of a headache. Eveline stood as though she had been turned to stone. "Did you hear?" Clara whispered, grasping her arm. "Eveline, do you understand what he has just done? He has publicly claimed you. He has placed you under his protection before the entire county." But Eveline did not answer. She could not, for she understood something far more profound than public protection. She understood that Adrian had risked something precious, his reputation, his standing, his carefully reconstructed sense of order, in order to defend her. And that risk, that vulnerability, that choice to stand beside her rather than retreat into the safety of his station, meant something that transcended propriety altogether. It meant that perhaps she was not unworthy of being seen. Perhaps, in his eyes, she had never been invisible at all. The ballroom of Ravensbourne Manor had been transformed into something from a fever dream. The autumn assemblies were meant to be occasions of refined elegance, but Adrian had commanded that every surface glitter with candlelight. Hundreds of candles in their sconces threw dancing shadows across the gilded cornices. The great mirrors along the walls reflected and multiplied the light until the space itself seemed to be burning from within. Eveline stood at the top of the grand staircase, her grey silk having been replaced by a gown of palest ivory, its bodice embroidered with silver thread in a pattern of intertwined vines and flowers. Mrs. Hensmore had wept when she saw the final creation, had wept for reasons Eveline did not fully understand, but suspected involved the conversation Adrian had had with her 2 days previous, a conversation Eveline had not been permitted to witness, but whose result had been clear. Eveline was no longer a dependent, a burden, a woman living on the charity of relations. She had been elevated to something else entirely. What that something was, she was uncertain, but with each step down the staircase, she felt it becoming clearer. Adrian waited at the bottom of the steps, dressed in evening clothes of such formal perfection that he seemed less a man than a personification of aristocratic power. Yet when his eyes found hers, all the authority of his station seemed to fall away. In its place was something far more honest, vulnerability, longing, and a kind of desperate hope. "Miss Hartwell," he said, extending his hand to her as she descended the final steps. "May I claim the opening dance?" She placed her hand in his, and the moment their palms met, she felt the tremor of his barely contained emotion. They moved together toward the dance floor, where the orchestra waited, instruments poised. Around them, the assembled guests of the county watched with something between anticipation and scandalized speculation. Lady Agatha stood near the refreshment table, her expression acid. The orchestra began to play. As Adrian drew her into the opening waltz, Eveline found herself suspended in a moment that seemed to exist outside of ordinary time. They danced in silence for several turns, and she was aware of nothing but the gentle pressure of his hand at her waist, the careful distance he maintained between them, the way his eyes never left her face. "I hope you will forgive me," he said finally, as they moved through the pattern of the dance, "for the crudeness of my recent intervention. I had intended to approach this matter with greater delicacy." "You have done nothing that requires my forgiveness, Your Grace," Eveline replied, though her voice trembled. "You have extended me a courtesy that no one else has thought to offer." "It is considerably more than courtesy," he said, and there was such intensity in his voice that several nearby dancers turned to stare. "Miss Hartwell, Eveline, I am not a man given to eloquence or grand gestures. I have spent much of my life learning to master violence rather than words, but I will attempt now to speak plainly." The dance carried them in a graceful circle. Outside the windows, November rain fell softly against the glass, as though the world itself were holding its breath. "When I returned from the war," Adrian continued, "I believed myself irreparably broken. I believed that the things I had witnessed, the things I had done, had transformed me into something incapable of feeling anything but duty and despair. And then you entered my chambers, uninvited and unannounced, and something in me that I had thought lost forever began to stir back toward life." They came to the end of the opening sequence, and the other dancers parted to allow them center stage. Adrian drew her into a closed hold, his hand firm at her waist, his expression solemn and absolute. "I have known you for only a matter of weeks," he said, "and yet I feel as though I have known you always. As though some part of my soul recognizes in you a kindred spirit, someone who has also learned what it means to be diminished by circumstances beyond one's control, and who has chosen nevertheless to remain gentle, to remain true." Eveline's eyes had filled with tears. She could not speak, could not do anything but meet his gaze and allow him to see in that moment that she understood. "I cannot offer you a conventional proposal," Adrian said, his voice dropping so that only she could hear, though every person in the ballroom was watching them with bated breath. "I cannot kneel, cannot shower you with protestations of undying love in the manner that novels suggest. What I can offer you is this. I can offer you a life in which you are not merely tolerated but cherished. I can offer you a home in which you are not a dependent but a partner. I can offer you my complete devotion, freely given, for the remainder of my years." He paused, and in that pause was all the vulnerability of a man asking for his own salvation. "I can offer you," he continued, "my hand, my title, my heart, which I have carefully guarded, but which I now place entirely in your keeping, trusting that you will not allow it to be shattered again. Will you, Miss Hartwell? Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The ballroom had gone absolutely silent. Even the orchestra had ceased its playing. Every eye in the room was fixed upon them, upon Adrian kneeling with one knee upon the dance floor, his hand extended toward her, and upon Eveline, who stood frozen, unable to comprehend that the moment she had feared above all others, public exposure, public judgment, had been transformed into something transcendent. She began, but no words seemed adequate. How could she express in language what she felt? How could she explain that in his eyes she had found not the judgment she had feared, but the recognition she had craved with every fiber of her being? "I will," she said finally, and her voice rang out clearly through the vast space. "Yes, Your Grace, yes, Adrian, 1,000 times, yes." He rose, and the relief and joy that crossed his face seemed to illuminate the ballroom even more brightly than the candles that surrounded them. He drew her hand to his lips and kissed it, a gesture that was both reverential and passionate, both proper and utterly intimate. And then the ballroom erupted. The orchestra began to play again, a triumphal waltz. The assembled guests, even those who had doubted her, even those who had whispered the cruelest insinuations, began to applaud, recognizing in that moment the essential truth that seemed to have escaped them before, that Adrian Wolfe, the Duke of Ravensbourne, a man who had faced death without flinching, had chosen vulnerability. He had chosen love. As Adrian led her through the first dance of her engagement, Eveline found herself thinking of that moment in his chambers when she had fled from the accusations of the world, seeking sanctuary. She had not understood then that sanctuary would take the form of a man's eyes, weary, battle-scarred, lonely, but infinitely kind. She had not understood that the greatest safety one could find was not in hiding, but in being truly seen by another's soul. The key that had fallen from his chambers that night, the small iron key that symbolized all the doors that stood between them and a life lived in honesty, still rested upon his study table, a reminder of the moment when two broken people had discovered in each other the possibility of becoming whole. Spring had transformed Yorkshire into something approaching clemency. The gardens of Ravensbourne Manor bloomed with the tentative flowers of renewal, snowdrops giving way to crocuses, and the first brave roses beginning their annual resurrection. In the library, where this story had unfolded in conversation and careful touching of hands, the afternoon light fell soft and golden through windows that no longer seemed to frame only melancholy. Adrian sat near the fireplace, which no longer needed its flames to warm the room, reading by the window. But his attention was not upon his book. Instead, his eyes tracked the movement of the woman who occupied the chair opposite his, Eveline, now the Duchess of Ravensbourne, though she still introduced herself to the servants as simply Eveline when she thought no one was listening. She was embroidering a gown for their child, who would arrive in the summer, though they had told no one yet except Mrs. Hensmore, who had wept again, from joy this time, and the simple relief of being proven right in her initial assessment of her cousin's character. Lady Agatha had retreated to a smaller estate some distance away, her social influence diminished by her failure to bring about the scandal she had so carefully cultivated. The lesson, it seemed, was that cruelty unmasks itself, and kindness, true, selfless kindness, is a far more powerful force than malice. "Do you ever regret it?" Eveline asked, not lifting her eyes from her needlework. "The proposal in public? It was not the delicate, private matter you might have chosen." Adrian set down his book. "Not for a moment," he said. "There is no delicacy strong enough to withstand the poison of a lie. The only cure was truth, spoken openly before witnesses, and I would make that declaration again in the same manner, for the same reason." He rose and moved to her, kneeling beside her chair in a gesture that had become familiar and precious. He placed his hand gently upon the embroidery, stilling her work. "But I will confess," he continued, "that there is something I have wondered about." "What is that?" Eveline asked, finally lifting her eyes to his. "Whether you have fully understood what it means to have been chosen, not despite your circumstances, but because of them. Because in your vulnerability, you carried strength. Because in your suffering, you maintained grace. Because you taught me that the greatest courage is not in commanding others, but in allowing oneself to be known." Eveline reached out and traced very gently the line of the scar upon his jaw, a scar that had softened over the months, as though the warmth of love had somehow smoothed even the physical marks of his trauma. "Do you know what I think?" she asked softly. "I think that we were both searching for the same thing. We had both been told in 1,000 subtle ways that we were not enough. that our pain, our vulnerability, our failures made us unworthy, and then we found each other in that moment of accident, in that intersection of fear and darkness, and we discovered that when you truly see another person, not the roles they play, not the judgments others have cast upon them, but the essential truth of who they are, that seeing is itself a kind of love. A love that precedes all vows and gestures and public declarations. Adrian leaned forward and kissed her, a kiss that was tender and unhurried, a kiss that seemed to contain within it all the words that love demands, but which English, even the grandiloquent English of the Victorians, struggles to express. When he drew back, there was a lightness in his expression that Eveline had rarely seen there, the lightness of a man who has learned, finally, that he need not carry all burdens alone. "I have something for you," he said, rising. He moved to his study desk and withdrew a small object, returning to kneel once more beside her chair. It was the key, the iron key that had fallen that night, months ago, when Eveline had fled into his chambers seeking sanctuary. He had kept it, polished it, and threaded it onto a small silver chain. "I wish for you to wear this," Adrian said, fastening the chain about her neck so that the key rested against her heart. "Not as a symbol of locking anything away, but as a reminder. It opens nothing but memory. It recalls the moment when two broken people found each other in darkness, and it promises that whatever doors may yet open before us, whatever joys or sorrows may await, we will face them together." Eveline held the key in her palm, feeling its weight, its reality. She thought of Lady Agatha's cruelty, of the whispered insinuations and calculated shame. She thought of the fear that had driven her into a strange room in the darkness. She thought of the moment when their eyes had met, and something essential in both of them had recognized something essential in the other. "I love you," she said, and the words seemed inadequate for the vastness of what she felt. "I love you with a love that frightens me in its completeness. I love you as I did not believe it was possible to love." Adrian drew her hand to his lips once more, and in that gesture was all the reverence, all the tenderness, all the passionate devotion that a man could offer. "And I," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "have loved you from the moment I first saw you, trembling in my doorway, afraid but dignified. From that moment forward, you have been the light by which I navigate the world. You have been my hope, my healing, my home." Outside, the spring breeze rustled through the budding trees. In the drawing room below, the servants prepared the household for dinner. In the world beyond Ravensbourne's walls, society continued its endless judgments, its careful calculations of worth and propriety. But in this room that had been sanctuary for their love, there existed a space that the world's cruelty could not touch, a space where two people who had learned what it meant to be diminished had discovered in each other the infinite possibility of being restored. Dear listener, if you have journeyed with Eveline and Adrian to this moment, then you have perhaps recognized something of yourself in their story, something that speaks to a fear you carry, a shame that was not of your own making, a wound inflicted by the careless judgment of others. We live in a world that is far too quick to diminish, too eager to label, too certain in its assessments of worth. We look at a woman whose circumstances are humble, and we tell her she is not enough. We observe a man whose pain is visible, and we counsel him to suppress it, to command it, to transform it into something harder and colder than feeling allows. We whisper insinuations. We share half-truths. We build monuments of cruelty upon foundations of gossip and fear. But this story speaks of something else entirely. It speaks of the transformative power of being truly seen, of the courage it takes to stand in the light of another's gaze without flinching away, of the sacred trust that exists between two people who have learned to recognize suffering in one another and have chosen, despite the risk, to offer their hearts. Perhaps you, too, have felt the weight of undeserved judgment. Perhaps you, too, carry wounds that were inflicted by circumstances beyond your control. Perhaps you, too, have stood in metaphorical darkness, believing yourself to be invisible, believing that the world had no place for someone like you. But I wish to tell you this. You are not too old. You are not too plain. You are not too broken. You are not too diminished by your past to deserve the gift of being loved, truly, completely, without reservation. Your vulnerability is not a weakness. It is evidence of your humanity. Your gentleness in the face of cruelty is not a failing. It is proof of your strength. There exists somewhere in this world a person, or perhaps many people, who will see you as Adrian saw Eveline. Who will recognize in your pain a mirror of their own? Who will choose, despite the risk, to stand beside you and say, I see you, I know you, and I choose you? Do not give up your hope for that recognition. Do not allow the whispered judgments of others to convince you that you are unworthy of love. Fight for the right to be seen. Fight for the right to stand in the light. And when, if that person appears, have the courage to extend your hand and say, yes. Let us build a life together, not in spite of our brokenness, but through the recognition of it, and the choice to heal in company rather than in solitude. And now, dear listener, I make a small request. If Eveline and Adrian's story has touched your heart, if their journey toward each other has kindled some small hope in you, I ask that you share this story with someone you love. Comment below and tell us, whose eyes do you hope will see you as truly as Adrian saw Eveline? What part of this story resonated most deeply with your own experience? What would it mean to you to be chosen, not despite your circumstances, but because of them? And if you have not yet subscribed to our channel, I invite you to do so. Each week we bring you stories of redemption and recognition, of people who have learned that being broken is not the same as being unworthy of love. Join our community and know that you are not alone in your longing to be truly seen, truly known, and truly loved. Thank you, dear listener, for allowing us to share this story with you. It has been our pleasure and our privilege to walk with you through Eveline's fear, Adrian's darkness, and the light that emerged when two people chose to recognize each other's worth. Until next time, from all of us at Victorian Love Stories, may you find or may you continue to nurture a love that sees you completely, judges you kindly, and chooses you again and again without hesitation or regret.